Well, good evening. I'm Susie Beiersdorfer, President of National Community Rights Network, NCRN, and our board welcomes you to this event titled The U.S. Constitution, Pull the Curtain and Expose the Truth to Dispel the Make-Believe. I represent Ohio as a board member and secretary of the Ohio Community Rights Network, that's OHCRN. Also on the NCRN board are Tom Groover, director of the Colorado CRN, Nancy Ward, secretary of the Oregon CRN, Doug Darrell, secretary for NCRN and a board member of the New Hampshire CRN, and Heidi Divya-Bertude, president of the Virginia CRN and secretary for Friends of Buckingham. This event comes out of an amazing 2007 article co-written by our guest, Greg Coleridge, entitled The U.S. Constitution, Pull the Curtain. Tom Groover will be our moderator. The core of the NCRN's work is the belief that unalienable rights and the right to self-governance, both individually and in local communities, should be the law of the land. Self-governance means that a community should have the right to make decisions for the common good. A few housekeeping items. Please mute yourself at all times except when you are speaking, as we are recording this event. I will monitor this and will mute if there are any noise disturbances. Tom will give an introduction and then introduce Greg for his presentation. During the Q&A, you can either use the hand raise icon, which is in the reaction button along the bottom. That will move you to the upper left, or you can put your question in the chat. Heidi will be monitoring the chat, or maybe I will be now, and to add links. I'll be adding links and such. So we will do our best to make sure that you're able to ask your question or have it passed along to Tom. Please feel comfortable to express yourself while also being respectful of everyone's time and comments. We encourage brevity over pontification. Again, we welcome you, and now I will introduce Tom Groover. So Dr. Tom Groover is Vice President of NCRN and Director of COCERN, Colorado CRN. The oil and gas industry had planned to drill 1,800 new fracking wells within the Boulder neighborhoods. Just a minute here. On behalf of COCERN and with the help of Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, CELDEF, Tom led the planning and establishment of the Boulder County Community Rights Network and launched its 2014 Boulder County, Colorado initiative to adopt a home rule charter with a community bill of rights for banning fracking. Tom also served as secretary of the board of directors for East Boulder County United. With CELDEF's help, EBCU wrote the Lafayette, Colorado Community Bill of Rights for banning fracking, which was voter approved and adopted into law. Unfortunately, this Bill of Rights was preempted by the Colorado Oil and Gas Association and the state of Colorado. Dr. Groover was also a director for Coloradans for Community Rights. That's a political action committee, which attempted to enact 2 Colorado state initiatives for adding an amendment to the Colorado Constitution to legalize local community self-government. This amendment sought to allow communities affected by harmful corporate projects to enact and enforce laws to protect themselves and nature. The political pressure exerted by these local and state community rights actions contributed to a further extension of Boulder County's fracking moratorium and the Colorado legislature's enactment of a 2,000-foot setback rule for permitting new fracking wells in Colorado. Dr. Groover is director of Boulder Chiropractic Clinic and lives with his wife, Karen, in Superior, Colorado. Take it away, Tom.
Thank you, Susie. tonight is a celebration of some very deep thinking that went on years ago. And it's the thinking that I wanted to do. And just to give you a little perspective, I searched on the web about the democracy in the United States Constitution, and a group called POCLAD came up, and I found an article that just blew my socks off. And then I don't usually look at the authors until I've scanned the article, and then I noticed that one of the article authors was Greg Coleridge, and I remember him from Move to Amend. I think we shared a couple of events and had a chance to visit with him. And so thought that it would be really great to, there's some feedback on the line here. So can everybody make sure you're unmuted that's not participating as a speaker? Thanks.
That'll be me.
Okay. We thought, well, rather than try and do this work ourselves, let's use what's there, because I don't think I could do better, and I don't think anybody could do better. I'm going to introduce Greg in a moment, but he is a pretty busy guy. He publishes a weekly calendar called Real Democracy, which I love. And this week there was an article, and I just want to share a quote from this article that he linked in this email, and it's written by Caitlin Johnstone at caitlinjohnstone.com, and it's about society. The title is "Society is Made of Narrative. Realizing this is awakening from the Matrix." And I pulled this out of here because it pertains to tonight's meeting, pertaining narrative. And then there are the oligarchs, the master manipulators. These corporate kings of the modern world have learned the secret that every ruler since the dawn of civilization has known. Whoever controls the narratives that are believed by a society is the controller of that society. Identity, language, etiquette, social roles, opinions, ideology, religion, ethnicity, philosophy, agendas, rules, laws, money, economics, jobs, hierarchies, politics, government, all mental constructs which only influence society to the extent that they are believed and subscribed to by a significant majority of the collective. If you have influence over things that people believe about those mental constructs, you have influence over society. You rule it. The oligarchs manipulate the narratives of entire societies. The next thing I wanted to just do is talk briefly about the historic context surrounding the Constitution. And I just arbitrarily picked the 1773 Boston Tea Party and the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. A Revolutionary War, 1783. First Continental Congress, 1774. Second was on 1775 and lasted until 81. The Articles of Confederation were signed in 1777. There was a Confederation Congress between 81 and 89, and then in 1787 there was a Constitutional Convention. And this is when all the, in my opinion, the mischief began. The Constitution was signed in 1787, and then to give you perspective, then the slaves were freed in 1763, officially and legally. So between 1776 and 1787, between the Declaration of Independence and the signing and adoption of the Constitution, there was 11 years. And a lot of people think that the Declaration and the Constitution are continuous, that there's continuity there. There's, that everything is in the Declaration. is written into the Constitution. In fact, many people think that the Declaration is the Constitution. They're confused. So there's 11 years there between those documents, and a lot happened during that time. And we should contemplate those things as we listen to Greg talk. And then between the time that the 1776, the Declaration, and the 1863 freeing of the slaves, there was 76 years. So just something to put perspective on this. So we're just about there now, but I want to quote something that Greg put in his article, and I might be stealing his thunder here, but it's a quote by historian Edward Morgan. Government requires make-believe. Make-believe that the king is divine. Make-believe that he can do no wrong, or make-believe that the voice of the people is the voice of God. Make-believe that the people have a voice, or make-believe that the representatives of the people are the people. Make-believe that governors are the servants of the people. Make-believe that all men are equal, or make-believe that they're not. So Greg is co-director of Move to Amend. He previously worked for more than 3 decades with the American Friends Service Committee in Ohio, where he educated, advocated, and organized on a range of justice, peace, environmental, and democracy issues, including helping coordinate Move to Amend activities in the Buckeye State. He's written a number of books, articles, and the 2003 documentary Corpo Nation, the story of citizens and corporations in Ohio. He currently maintains and distributes via email a weekly Real Democracy History Calendar and Monetary History Calendar. Greg is a board member of the Alliance for Just Money. He previously served an elected term on the National Governing Board of the Common Cause, and was a principal with the program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy, or POCLAD. He loves camping, hiking, walking, and swimming, especially with his wife, daughter, and son-in-law, and almost everything else outdoors. So Greg, welcome to the conversation.
Well, thank you ever so much, Tom and Susie, and other board members of National Community Rights Network for this invitation to engage with all of you this evening. And thanks to all of you for doing what I don't like to do, which is be indoors in the summer months. But I guess you're stuck indoors. Well, maybe not. Maybe some of you are outdoors if the weather and the lighting is can do well. Even not. It could be dark and could still be outdoors. But I thank you for this opportunity to share with you a few thoughts about this article that sadly, I must say, as with all too many of the writings that many of us do, and I'm sure the same is true with many of you, which is you write something one day and it sadly is still relevant the next, if not the next week, if not the next month, if not the next year, if not the next decade, because certain issues and problems associated with what it is we are trying to accomplish are just so entrenched, so ingrained, that despite our best efforts at doing sometimes conventional, educating, advocating, and organizing, and even somewhat unconventional, it just seems like these problems are so protracted and so deep, in part due to the narrative, due to the basic culture, due to the story of how we exist. And that is certainly a big feature, a main feature of this article, not to mention what Caitlin Johnstone said in the article quoted by Tom in the introduction. And thank you for that generous one. And by the way, in the course of him mentioning, quoting that article in this history calendar that I put together once a week, I posted a link to it in the chat. If you are not subscribing to it, it's free. It comes in your mailbox every Monday morning. I try to get it out by 9 a.m. Eastern time. So feel free to take a look at that. And if you so care to sign up to it. But its origins actually go back to POCLAD, of which I was a principle of. And, one of the things we put together was this newsletter called By What Authority? And this happens to be the issue that we're going to be talking about this evening. This was the regular sort of think piece of this think tank of frustrated activists. And that's what POCLAD was. Frustrated in that we came from various fields, whether it was peace, I guess you could say that's where I came from, peace and economic justice. Others came from labor background. Peter Kelman, Doug Darrell, who's on this call, just visited with him today from New Hampshire. Roger, I should say, Ward Morehouse and Grossman from the co-founders came from environmental and international justice backgrounds, environmental backgrounds. We all came from various backgrounds, but we were all frustrated in realizing we weren't getting far enough, fast enough doing conventional, regular work. And so we came together. I came in rather late to sort of try to get a sense of why is it we're in this situation of where we are constantly and forever responding, reacting, and resisting, always playing defense. And it sort of, as we dug deep, and particularly Richard Grossman and Ward Morehouse and Jane Ann Morris, and Virginia Rasmussen, the co-author of this piece this evening, and several others in POCLAD, realized that it had to do with the powers to be, the one percenters who founded this country and who grounded into the founding document, the Constitution, the first to some extent, but certainly the second. What we know of is our Constitution being the second, Articles of Confederation being the first, is the property document. And that led to just a variety of ways over time that the rights of people were secondary to the rights of property. So the POCLAD principles, sort of thinkers, began to just do research, and what our contribution was to just try to get information out there, to get on the other side of the learning curve, since the narrative, since the story, since what it is we have been taught and conditioned has been dead wrong from day one. It has, as Tom said in quoting historian Edward Morgan, from day one, make believe. And that is certainly a timely quote, sadly, a timely quote that was created decades ago, but just as relevant today. The only other thing I'll say, just sort of by way of introduction, is that as we think about these issues, and POCLAD got its start in sort of unearthing this history of the relationship between corporations and human beings, we the people, and realized that what is going on today, this was a couple decades ago, but when POCLAD first got started, but is still the same today in terms of that relationship, was one of corporate entities being subordinate, not equal to or superior to. And of course, that whole script has been flipped. But we realized, even when we began to understand that if we were able to turn the clock back and use charters as they were once intended to be used, which as defining tools to define and authorize what companies could or could not do, if we were able to ultimately have that power and authority and definition to tightly control what corporate entities could do through the charter process or the licensing, it still wouldn't be remotely enough. It still wouldn't come close to what needs to happen for people to authentically self-govern, to authentically be we the people for the very first time, because it's never been that way. It's never been a grand, glorious, democratic nirvana, no matter what period of time, no matter what date on the calendar throughout history that this article tries to convey. And so here we are in this situation. So I want to share the screen briefly and just very briefly go over a few items in this article to try to highlight, and then we can go at it and kind of custom discuss a variety of items in this piece. So I just want to start basically with sort of the first paragraph that sort of underlines and underscores what I think is the heart of this whole piece, that we have a big problem in this country. It goes deeper than the vast arrays of serious issues. At its root is not politics, economic, social, or even as deadly as the ecological problem, back in 27 when this was written, or even today. We don't have ultimately a political problem, an economic problem, a social problem, or even an ecological problem. It's a problem of the mere fact that we don't have a functioning, legitimate democracy. And the reason for that is because of this problem of belief or make believe, that we, the people, are not in control, despite the fact that we have been conditioned to believe that we are. And it all centers on this document, which we know of as the Constitution. And the Constitution is, I think it's important to understand what it is and what constitutions are. If you just think about it in general, whether it's in this country, whether it's in other countries, what are constitutions? Constitutions exist at the federal level. Most states have their own, if not all, constitutions, and most municipalities that are governing, that are home rule municipalities have their own constitutions. They don't call them constitutions, they call them charters. And basically what charters or state or federal constitutions are basically these items, sort of the supreme law of that jurisdiction. It's the charter or the document that sort of lays out the laws of that particular jurisdiction, whether it's municipality, state, or nation. It's a set of bylaws. It's, if you will, the legal codification of what we believe is or should be the social contract between people, between one another, and between people and the institution that we create. That's either called the city government, the state, the federal government, whatever the case may be. It's a binding document reflecting the best principles, the best values, and the best aspirations, we hope. That's what it should be. That's what it's defined to be. That's what we hope it should be. Again, the Articles of Confederation were the first constitution. It had its I think, some real positive features to it. There was no executive, no national courts. It was a single body. It was not bicameral, meaning there was no upper or lower chamber, no, if you will, House and Senate. It was just one body. You needed the 2/3 majority, one vote per state. You needed 2/3 of the states to pass a unanimous vote for amending the Constitution, and some other things that are listed there. What the US Constitution that we know of today was about was basically sort of presented to the country as, we need to come together to amend the Articles of Confederation, to quote unquote improve the early Articles of Confederation. And basically what happened is that it was, hopefully going to be the codification of the alternatives to the grievances and articulated aspirations as defined in the Declaration of Independence. So we're going to take some of those basic values and principles and codify them and statutorily place them as articles, as elements in this Constitution. And of course, what we know of is the danger of make-believe. And so did that in fact happen? Here's what the Declaration of Independence, some of the what people thought were the very best aspirations that ended up not making the Constitution. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, of course it was only men at the time, are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. The other aspirations, among them anyway, is whenever any form of government becomes obstructive of these ends, it is the right, capital R, right of the people to alter or to abolish it. In fact, it goes even beyond the right. It is not simply the right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. So these were among sort of the very highest principles, goals, aspirations that were contained in the Declaration of Independence, that the promoters of the Constitution said, oh yeah, we'll put them in to the Constitution. And in some ways, okay, in a few ways.
Greg, can I interrupt for just a moment?
Sure.
Do you want to put that PowerPoint in presenter mode?
Well, I could, but I'm kind of jumping around.
Okay.
From one to the other. That's why I'm not doing that.
Sorry.
So so long as people can read this, then I hope that's okay. Can make it a little larger. But anyway, just to say that in a couple of instances, these listed here, it is truly and was truly something that was, for the very first time, very transformative, given the leadership and the definition of governing in other parts of the world. In fact, most other countries were ruled by kings, queens, and sovereigns, individual people who got their powers from quote unquote God, not from one another and the affirmation of one another. And so these are the ways that in some senses it was a revolutionary document. Don't necessarily go into them, but here is the place that I just want to stop for a moment. And if I might share with you a story. And that story is, I don't know, it was maybe the 80s or 90s, when I was invited in Ohio to a regional gathering of, at that time, a group known as the Patriots. Today, they're the Oath Keepers and other groups that are sort of more extremist, but back then it was the Patriots and the militia. And both of these organizations would oftentimes meet together in Ohio. They had regional meetings. And the secretary of the Patriot and militia group in sort of northeast, sort of central Ohio, was a Mennonite, and I worked for a Quaker organization, American Friends Service Committee, and we had done a few things together as Mennonite Church. And he invited me to speak to this group about, at the time we were working on issues regarding trade, free trade issues, and opposed to international trade agreements that weren't really about trade at all, but about corporate rule. And we were also involved in doing work around local currencies, which intrigued them a lot because many of these organizations were all about doing sort of local help and helping one another and doing an end run around governing and government and the like. So I came down and spoke to this group. And what I found quite interesting, among many things, including this was October, of course, the United Nations was formed in October. So before I spoke, they burned a UN flag right there on the floor of the venue we were at. But the one thing I found most interesting about it is before I spoke, they were giving announcements of all the things they do week to week and between monthly meetings, of which I was at, is that they would hold weekly meetings and they would alternate these meetings between studying the Bible and studying the Constitution. So the first Wednesday was studying the Bible. Second Wednesday, studying the Constitution. Third Wednesday, Bible. Fourth Wednesday, Constitution, back and forth like that. And the takeaway I came from that was that this group, and I think it transcends this group to maybe the nation at large to some extent, if not to a great extent, is that the sacredness and the reverence that many people in this country have toward our nation's Constitution, because of this culture, because of the narrative that's been presented before us, because of what we learn, quote unquote, in school, because of the story. That's what the Bible is it not? A series of stories, and that's what the Constitution is. It has been sort of akin to Moses coming down from the Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments. It is that sort of sacred and revered, with the founders being these highly intelligent people, of which many very much were, but given this sort of aura of perfection, that they got it right with just a few minor modifications over the years that we call the amendments to the Constitution, that has been thought of and internalized and incorporated into people's very being almost. That I think that when we talk about and go forth beyond ourselves to the general public, we need to be careful and tread somewhat carefully and strategically on how it is we talk about this. And it has to be a balancing act between pointing out the flaws, pointing out the limitations, pointing out, as this program is doing, the fundamental, indefensible limits of the Constitution, because as this document, as this article points out, the framers, the winners of the war for who's going to control this country, decided what the Constitution would say. And there were other choices to be made. choices that were much more just and much more, I think, inclusive than what happened. So we need to find that balancing act, that treading on pointing out very clearly and very unequivocally the shortcomings, but to understand that in the time, to a certain extent, at least in these items, to these extents, it was dramatic. It was a change. It was a step, not nearly as much of a step as needed to be had and should had, and that we need to make today, because impediments that were built in have made it more difficult, that we'll get to momentarily. So anyway, sorry for belaboring that point, but I think it's important to make, and it was certainly a takeaway I had from my meeting with the patriots and the militiamen and a few women in central Ohio. So anyway, this article, I'll just go through it, very briefly, just sort of speaks to the issue around the problems associated with the original Constitution, who were some of the framers and some of their biases. It speaks to, quoting Lawrence Goodwin in The Populist Moment. If you've not seen this book, it talks about the agrarian revolt in the 1870s through 1890s, where people at that time, sort of these quote unquote stupid farmers, understood that the system was rigged and that they needed to have a form of democracy, and came up with their own sort of principles and alternatives and amendments to the Constitution, known as the Omaha Platform of 1876, on the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, exactly July 4th, 1876, in Omaha, Nebraska. It's a wonderful description of how people came together and tried to organize and do education, but not just education, but to organize to change state constitutions, to elect people to the Senate, to the House of Representatives in their own political party, to create alternatives, to do all of these separate steps that I think are transformative, that we can learn from today as we seek fundamental transformation of our own society, which needs to include not just changing faces in legislative assemblies or changing statutes, but changing some of what is in the Constitution as we know it to be. The dangers of make-believe are things that were already pointed out. There were a number of features, again, in this section that I think are positive in the Constitution that I went over. But despite, again, despite people believing that we have this Constitution, this sort of incredible document, that this notion that we the people are all the people, which has never, ever been the case, that despite all of this and what we learn, governing power has never, ever rested ultimately with us, with any of us at the bottom, with none of us who are sort of people at the top politically, men and women of wealth, of privilege, of whiteness, of maleness, of having the highest income and highest wealth. Governing power would not rest, as is mentioned here, with the property less, because the document itself, the Constitution, was meant to be from day one a document that affirmed property. We must remember the Bill of Rights, what we know of as the Bill of Rights, was not included in the original Constitution. That's why it's called the first 10 amendments. It was, if you will, just sort of, just kind of an added item to it that was only added when a number of people, the rabble, if you will, in a number of states said that we who control the state legislatures in our respective places, who in many cases had their own in their state constitutions Bill of Rights that protected liberty to some extent, that gave rights to some extent to people without property, and gave voting rights to some extent wider than was described in the Constitution, original Constitution, said we will not ratify this. And so the founders sort of backed off and said, all right, we will agree to that as sort of a second tier. This will be ratified, and then we will separately create this first 10 amendments that will be called the Bill of Rights. But despite that, all of this, nevertheless, we didn't have authentic democracy before any of this has happened, including what has happened since. We've never had an authentic democracy. And as I mentioned before, the framers did have options. It's not like you oftentimes hear, well, they were stuck in their moment of time. We can't blame them. They didn't know that slavery was not a good thing. Many of them had it. That was just sort of the culture of their moment. They were stuck in that. And just as we are, doing things today that 50 years from now, we may be aghast at, or those who are our descendants will be aghast at. Same with them. Well, that is simply untrue, because there was a vigorous and well-organized effort among the, if you will, losers of the framers of the Constitution, the anti-federalists, who were pushing for the Constitution to include certain items that never were included in that original Constitution. And maybe in subsequent programs, we'll get into that more so. But Joyce Appleby in the American Heritage lists a number of things that were choices that could have been included, but were not. Citizens could have had more of a role in the making of decisions. They could have defined the course of commerce beyond being more buyers and sellers. And the rest, the last one here, the framers could have made governance an admired, not a disparaged enterprise, politics honorable rather than despised. The Constitution could have been made easier to change, permitting a better fit within our cultural evolution. So, these things were choices to be made, and the choices were conscious, the choices were deliberate, the choices were significant, because there were concerns about the democracy, if you will, getting out of hand with individuals who we kind of revere today, who had qualms, serious qualms about, I'm trying to find, where is it here, where several of those individuals, from John Jay, who said individuals who own the country ought to govern it, and other people. James Madison. This article talks about George Washington, Alexander Hamilton. These are individuals, if you read some of their quotes that are listed in here, you will see some of the serious misgivings that these founders had, who are lionized today. In fact, in the case of Alexander Hamilton, they even made a bloody play about him that was very popular and remains popular on Broadway. Hey, great music, but horrible partial history that is told in that particular play, and nothing about his concern about the rabble becoming too independent. And so thus the tyranny of the majority was feared, and thus certain elements had to be incorporated into the Constitution to prevent the tyranny of the majority from ruling. Never mind of the concern of there possibly being a tyranny of the minority, of which basically the Constitution has become, as several of these undemocratic elements have contributed to. So what are some of those elements? Let's sort of shift down here to what they are. And so in this whole section of, and here's this, so in this section of we, the propertied people, and democratic provisions of the US Constitution, here is the paragraph or two that speak to some of the quotes of our founding quote unquote fathers. And they all were fathers after all, who were concerned about there being way, way too much democracy. So let's get into this. Limited personhood. Again, we don't have to get into much of this. Some of you are already well aware of this. I've already spoken a little bit of this. White male property owners, other people were either considered to be, in the case of African Americans, 3/5 persons, or in the case of Native, or in the case of women, they only had rights to the extent of their male relatives, whether it was brothers, husbands, nephews, others related to them. They had very few rights on their own. Native people had basically no rights. In the Declaration of Independence, they weren't even considered 1/5 or 0/5 persons. They were considered beasts for that matter. So very limited personhood given. And what, of course, we have seen in the course of history since are those groups who are not included in the Constitution organizing themselves into mass movements to drive themselves into this document where they should have been all along. And that driving and that work continues. The ERA, for example, is still something that is not included in the Constitution of this country, is not an amendment, which it should be. There still is not full-fledged equal rights for women, despite the fact now that as of 2020, the state of Virginia became the 38th state to ratify the Constitution, but nevertheless, because of some weirdness in terms of placing a date on the number of years of ratification, and the fact that several states have revoked their ratification, all of this now is held up in court. Who knows how many more months, if not years, that will be. So women still are not, and people of color still not to a great extent. We still don't have the right technically to vote. So personhood is far, far from being guaranteed in the Constitution to this day. Trans people and many other people, never mind, right? Never mind what the incredible work of NCRN and CELDEF has put forth and has initiated around the rights of nature. There's nowhere to be seen something like that in the Constitution. Another is no direction election of senators. That only came to be because of a movement, basically a threat. There was a threat. In fact, many people in many states calling for a Article 5 constitutional convention and passing and calling for that in the states. People may know that the Constitution can be amended in two ways, one through Congress. That's how the 27 amendments heretofore we have. The other is to do an end run around Congress and go directly to the states and get states to call for a convention that is issue specific. And that's what many states did around what became the 17th Amendment. And Congress was basically so terrified about the prospect of that happening that they went ahead and did that. So what became basically just a horrible pay-to-play system, unbelievable corruption in which senators were basically chosen by the state legislatures. And many times those senators just completely bribed. The one senator, I think Senator Clark from Montana, just basically handed in 1880s a $1,000 bill. Think about it, a $1,000 bill to every state legislator in the state of Montana to vote him in to become the senator, where he was for, I think, 8 years. So no direction election of senators that was done. So we had basically no way for people in the states to vote for their senators. They could only vote for their representatives, but of course, only white male property owners, which amounted, if you go back here at the time, roughly about 6% of the population at the time of 1789 were eligible to vote. Now that did expand sort of fairly early on when people without males, white, without property, were given the franchise. But even then, that amount, that percentage only went up, I think, to something like the mid-teens. The Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8. This is one of the most maybe hidden, unappreciated, horrific, undemocratic provisions. Commerce became uber alles. If you want to find a fantastic book that talks about sort of the history of that, Jane Ann Morris, who is the late Jane Ann Morris, I sadly say, who is a principal, worked with me and many others in POCLAD, wrote this book called Gaveling Down the Rabble, How Free Trade is Stealing Our Democracy. That's basically what the Commerce Clause was. It was an effort to say that commerce transcends basically state law at the federal level. And it was so effective in doing that, in saying that commerce sort of has this power uber alles to define what should take place at the federal level, that, if you will, that notion of commerce being the penultimate goal with property and the selling and trading of goods, that notion was adopted, if you will, and has become kind of almost glowingly or sadly referred to as the granddaddy or the baby NAFTA. And the same with the World Trade Organization and with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and all these other so-called trade deals have sort of borrowed the same notion of saying that trade should be the ultimate goal and the ultimate privilege and the ultimate power and the ultimate authority of people at the federal level. And if you at the state level, this was Commerce Clause, if you at the state level pass laws that try to limit trade, that try to limit commerce from coming into the state, that try to give your local businesses preferential treatment, that try to prevent the importation of agribusinesses, that try to say that we want to try to stop, toxic chemicals from coming in to my community. All of that is defined not as toxic chemicals, not as horrible hog farms coming in, not as terrible products that are being sold on my shelves in my state. It's not defined in that way. It's defined rather as commerce. And once something is defined as commerce, it then is beyond the reach of people at the state level. The same is happening now at the federal level, and these so-called trade deals are not about trade at all, be it free or fair. It's about corporate rule. Who decides, who rules, who governs? And you're seeing these things now, maybe you've heard of them. They're called investor state dispute settlement programs. They're basically the arbiters. They are the super duper Supreme Courts. If you think our Supreme Court is sort of beyond the reach of we the people, it's nothing compared to these so-called tribunals that are set up through these international so-called trade deals, trade agreements, and these ISDSs, not to be confused with ISIS, though they share several principles, I would say, in terms of causing violence to people and having an ideology that is quite dangerous. And in the case of ISDSs, the ideology is that we, the people who are arbiters, who are all corporate attorneys, should have the final say in saying that trade is more important than defining protections at the nation state level that protects workers, consumers, the environment, and the like. So anyway, the Commerce Clause, one of the worst provisions there is, anti-democratic, in the Constitution. Holding citizens indefinitely without charge. This is the writ of habeas corpus, shall not be suspended. If you noticed, going back here, I defined the writ of habeas corpus not being suspended as a positive feature, as something that was revolutionary, and it was. But there's a clause in the Constitution that says the privilege of writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless, when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. Don't know if you recall or not, but remember Donald Trump was talking about maybe suspending habeas corpus at one time to try to control what he thought might be a rebellious population if and when they were serious in trying to overturn and were successful in trying to overturn elections and the votes in several states. The Contracts Clause is something as well, again, that doesn't get its fair, I think, contribution in terms of being very anti-democratic and very much in the realm of being pro-property. This is Article 1, Section 10, that basically states no state shall pass any law impairing the obligation of contracts. This sounds, pretty legit if you think about it. Well, a contract is a contract, right? If two parties sign it, it should be honored. What should be more fair and legitimate than that, right? The problem with that is it sounds fair until one considers the many instances in our society, not just in the past, but right up to the present, in which one party to a contract is much more potent, has much more leverage than another party, whether it's rich versus poor, employer versus employee, right? A landlord versus tenant, creditor versus debtor, there's many others. And so this obligation of contracts and following of contract clause, again, over the right of people and the right of communities to sort of pass laws that protects workers, protects debtors, protects employees, protects, the poor from the rich, has been, put in the kibosh. No direct election of the president. My goodness, we know the problems associated with, do we not, the Electoral College, which has been responsible for electing, for choosing presidents who in turn have elected and chosen, which have been ratified and approved, Supreme Court justices. It's an incredibly, the origins of that, of course, is goes back to the racist system of the South and the 3/5 clause of the Constitution. And it is something that exists in no other constitution on planet Earth. And in fact, is, if so wondrous, why doesn't it exist in a sort of a comparative idea or concept at a state level? Why does no state have something that is sort of like this? It'd be very easy to kind of come up with something that is kind of legitimate. And it's, it's proponents always say, well, this is sort of trying to protect the small communities and the small states from the large ones and the like. Well, there's a lot of rural counties in most states that could sort of claim the same thing, that their voices are not authentically heard. But there's never been any sort of serious, I don't think even proposal to try to do something like this, because it's laughable. It's dangerously laughable. It's fundamentally illegitimate at its core, and it should definitely be abolished. Appointment of Supreme Court for life. This pretty much how it exists in this country. And again, if you go back to the fact that the Supreme Court nominees are represent or are nominated by the president and then appointed or affirmed by the Supreme Court. Remember, the Supreme Court originally was chosen by the state legislatures. So originally, between the president, the Electoral College, and the Senate, the legislature choosing the Senate, no direct power, no direct role for citizens to choose and to have even kind of an indirect role of who Supreme Court justices would become. And we're paying the price for that now. That is incredible in terms of its danger for the anti-democratic decisions that are yet to come. Slaves are property, the Return Servants Clause, Article 4, Section 2. If slaves escaped the South and made it to the North, as people here know, they weren't free. They were just sort of, free from the South. But again, if they were housed, and there were just in the state of Ohio, 700 what were called sort of stops on the Underground Railroad that were run by people of faith, many of which happened to be Friends, but Presbyterians and Methodists and many others. They were violating the law. They were operating against the Constitution, and they could be fined, they could be jailed, and the like, because they were holding the slave owners' property. And so this was why many people had to follow the drinking gourd, so to speak, as Harriet Tubman said, and a song made in that name, which meant making it to Canada. Only there would they be free, because the North was still under this Return Servants Clause that was only abolished when slavery was abolished. Upheld, by the way, in the 1857 Dred Scott decision. Amending the Constitution. It is the hardest, I think, and what other people have said, of any constitution on the planet to amend. How difficult it is in terms of having 2/3 of each branch of Congress, 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and then once they pass whatever language it is, then 3/4 of state legislatures have to pass, whether it's by the legislature or by a constitutional convention held in that state. My God, how difficult it is. It shouldn't be necessarily super easy, as in many other countries, but other countries, and maybe this will be something for a further piece. I've done some research on this. There are some countries that have direct elections of who at least some of their Supreme Court justices will be. And in other countries, sometimes the legislature appoints them. In other places, there's term limits. In other places, there's age limits. I mean, there's a wealth of options here, but not in the United States. Once chosen, they become truly the Supremes. They become the new sovereigns, the new kings and the new queens of our society. And lastly, but not least, that is the last one that I will basically end here, that sort of lays out in this article. And there's some other ones that can be talked about, but these, Virginia and I, were thought the most democratically damaging and difficult right now to have anything approaching a real democracy, so long as these provisions continue to exist, and most importantly, continue along with the rest of this document to be revered as sacred and as something that is part of the narrative that should be so, I think, geared to being sort of changed, that's the battle mostly that we have to begin with, is to change sort of in people's head the belief and the sense that this document is something that can and should be looked at fundamentally. And I think maybe to the extent that we have seen the Supreme Court, in Q&A we can get into it, people going beyond sort of the barely tolerable. They have operated the Supreme Court now in some of their recent decisions so blatantly, grotesquely, anti-democratically that people now are not simply saying we need to reverse things like Roe v. Wade or the EPA versus West Virginia, but we need to look at the Supreme Court itself. So it's moving from reversing, in this case, the decisions to looking at the structure and the institutions. So I'll end it at that, and sorry for going so long.
Thanks, Greg. While we're at it, could you please give us your definition of democracy?
Well, I think it just basically comes down to those individuals who are being most affected by decisions should have some kind of legitimate role, authentic role, in the shaping of those decisions at every step of the process, beginning, middle, and end. Oftentimes citizens, as people may know here, at a local level, may have an opportunity to weigh in on sort of proposals that city or county commissions come up with, but those proposals are so far along, sort of, they're beyond sort of the proposal stage, that the input that citizens have are basically meaningless. So by having an authentic role, it should be in the shaping of those decisions. As those decisions are implemented, the monitoring of those decisions, and having sort of an authentic role in monitoring how it's going. So if the policies and the implementation by the implementers are getting off base, that can be noticed. There's transparency, and people can be called to move things, back on track. That's that stage. And the end stage, in sort of at the end, when something is completed or reported on at the end of the year or 2 years, having an authentic role in looking at and in monitoring and evaluating and going full circle. In that evaluation, then, if that proposal and that program is to continue, that then needs to be reshaped and redefined authentically at the beginning stage. So that should, in some way, somehow, that's the principle in my mind of what true authentic democracy or self-governance is all about.
Thank you. Another question is, what if the people that are elected, they do campaigning, they make campaign promises? What if their campaign promises could be held legally binding? Because it's common almost in every case, almost every campaign promise I've ever seen that means anything to me has been broken at the first, on the first day of someone's office, a lot of times.
Yeah. Well, interesting idea. Of course, better is one where, the system we have, a Republican system of government, is one where we elect, right? People to represent us, middlemen, middle women, middle people of any gender, surrogates. I think authentic democracy is one where people directly do an end run around decision makers and to try to have as many decisions as are reasonable to be directly defined by people directly. But I don't necessarily want to define, in my community where every stop sign goes, in my community, that's, or other things that I would, maybe have to take all of my time to study to know about. So there's a role for people who are representatives or surrogates. How to make them accountable? I think there's several ways to do that. Having them, follow a platform. I mean, part of it, of course, is that who are these people to begin with? Authentic representatives, I think, certainly exist, those that exist in some other places, and to some extent here, but not very much, not like some other countries, who arise, who come out of movements, who are accountable to that movement, who have sort of pushed them from being actors in that movement of resistance to say, okay, you've been on the outside, to have worked at trying to bring down the autocratic system the corrupt leaders. And now we want you to go from the outside, being sort of a representative and a leader of the movement, to now being an insider. So a person like that, who has already been accountable to a movement, I think is going to be definitionally in a better position to be accountable to those who put them in there right from the start, because they're going to be internally accountable to themselves, to their conscience, to the fact of who they are. Now, of course, there's pressures, right? Those special interests that come from those individuals because of the structure. So the other way to make those individuals accountable is to remove the cancers, the viruses, those special interests from the outside. That's where constitutions come in. That's where statutes come in. That's where the rules come in that try to create sort of a level playing field. So it's not just the millionaires and the billionaires who have the ear now and who can try to make that public official sway from their from their platform, but that their voices are no more heard than the voices of people who elected them, or people who didn't even elect them but are their constituents. So that's another way to make them more accountable. Whether they have to actually sign something and sort of be accountable to that, interesting. You have to think about it more. There's some kind of problems associated with that I see. Certainly if you say you're going to do something and fund something and then all of a sudden we have a pandemic, what do you do in that case? You would have to maybe veer off of your promise, saying you can't do that in the first year. So there would have to be some sort of conditions or exceptions to that.
One of the things that has affected community rights organizing is the Supremacy Clause, which basically says that this Constitution and the laws of the United States is the law of the land. It's the supreme law of the land, and that judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. So basically it just nullifies anything that's contrary to the Constitution that might be passed at the state level. But there's also the possibility that federal preemption could occur at the local level. And then what we're experiencing, when we do our lawmaking is something more along the lines of field preemption, it's called, where federal legislation takes over an area of law, and then if a state writes something in law that puts a law into effect that's contrary to that, then the federal wins, but also in the local level. If we try and write a law to ban fracking in Boulder, Colorado, then the state Supreme Court will preempt it, and that principle of preemption is rooted in the Supremacy Clause of the United States Constitution.
And it is. So it is. I think there's a distinction, and I know that CELDF and I think National Community Rights Network has made between those kinds of quote unquote laws, if not rights, that should be federal, if not international, if not global, inalienable rights of people to be treated with the ultimate dignity and respect and have fundamental sort of basic needs met, that I would like to see something that transcends even nation states. And that's certainly what the International Bill of Rights does. And we can sort of debate what those are, and there should be a healthy debate. But that's a distinction between those kinds of rights and decisions that I think are fundamental at a level. And I think decisions that are more fundamental at a level of governance, that's where it should be laid. So if you're talking about fracking in your community, that should be a community decision. If it's, to a certain extent that transcends a single community, that goes to a state or a county level to a state, well, then there should be the role of communities that are part of that state, as well as the state. And whether the nation, obviously the nation is part of the state, there may need to be a role for them, but it should be secondary, if not tertiary, to the role again of people who are being most directly affected. Now, how that actually gets squared away and codified, I don't know. I think there are some good minds that can come up with something and should come up with something. And of course, no law is ever final, right? Every law is something that will need to be altered and amended as time goes on, similar to constitutions. Beyond, though, an unalienable and inalienable rights that should be fixed forever, I think, at a federal level, if not actually at an international level. So I certainly identify with those of you who have had to deal with preemption or trumping of local or state laws by governing entities above or below, depending on how you want to look at it, that goes from local to state or from state to federal, that has been done solely to protect the interests, the powerful interests. And that's, I mean, let's be clear, that's why it happens. And that's how it's happened. And what that has meant, therefore, has been people who have been directly affected having subsequently basically no voice and no role in the decisions.
Well, thank you, Greg. I think it's gotten a little bit late this evening. We've gone over as usual. This is fascinating. What I'd like to do is turn the conversation back over to Susie and Heidi, see if there are any pressing questions that need answered that have shown up in the chat that we want to answer.
Yes.
I do. Yeah, there is one. There's been a lot of comments.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oops.
Sorry, I hit the wrong button. That was my fault. Unmute, please. Can you say that again, Heidi?
Let's see. There's been a lot of comments, but there is one question here, and this is from Richard Blake. And he says, Greg, thank you for your excellent presentation. Could you comment on the extent to which most of our fellow citizens equate suffrage with democracy? I mean, suffrage in and of itself is no defense against tyranny. There was suffrage under Stalin, there's suffrage in Turkmenistan, etc. So the distinction should be obvious.
Well, I guess I don't know enough about those other places to know, certainly voting in of itself or suffrage is not enough. It has never been enough. It is a piece of what needs to happen, but the ability of people to weigh in and to express their fundamental right at self-determination, self-governance, sovereignty, democracy, whatever you want to call it, but ultimately the ultimate right of having the power to decide for oneself should include suffrage, but needs and has always needed to transcend it. So if your question has an element that goes beyond that, I apologize for not addressing it, and feel free to either share, or I can give you, I will put my email in the chat. Feel free to reach out. And we can discuss this further.
Yeah, and then let's say, I thought I lowered my hand. Greg, maybe one more question. I know it's getting late. What is the status of the People's Amendment to the US Constitution? From Barbara Harris.
The We the People Amendment, HR 48, has 93 co-sponsors right now. It's the most we've ever had. It is, as you may know, an amendment calling for abolishing both political money defined in elections as free speech, First Amendment protected, and abolishing all, not just First Amendment, corporate constitutional rights as regarding elections, but Fourth Amendment search and seizure, Fifth Amendment contracts, or Fifth Amendment due process, takings and the like, 14th Amendment due process and equal protection rights, and a variety of other concerns that basically transcend just money and politics from corporate entities. Because as you well know, 14th Amendment has been used, Commerce Clause has been used to usurp corporate constitutional rights. So that's where we are. It's difficult, very difficult, because as people know, many in Congress now, Congress has been captured. Not just Republicans, but most Democrats, a good deal of them, I would say probably a majority of them. And we've gotten sort of the low-hanging fruit. Many of those who remain are the corporate Dems, and they come up with creative excuses of why they don't even want to talk about endorsing this. So in next session of the legislature, it's going to be doubly tough, because as we're seeing now in some of the primaries, some of those who are being elected are replacing some of the more progressive, quote unquote, with some of the more moderate pro corporate Dems. So time will tell how it goes, but it's an ongoing battle, but one that needs to be made, and feel free to join us.
Susie?
Yes, we actually are doing pretty well with time. I think that was a good way to end this. And Greg, thank you for your time and expertise. And again, that amazing article. We put it in the chat. Maybe we will get it back up there before we sign off. This is being recorded, so it will be available. I put in the chat website, Facebook, and other things to the National Community Rights Network, and also each of our state community rights network. We are so grateful for all of you who spent time with us tonight also. And we had said this is a part of a series. I'm pretty sure we're taking September off, but we will be coordinating with Greg to continue this conversation. Also take the time, if you haven't read that article, it is just so powerful. And then there's so many good articles on the POCLAD website, which again is on the chat. And so we will make sure that people that were on here tonight are sent, that information. If you're not on, the email list or the MailChimp for the National Community Rights Network, just send us an email and we'll get you on. And thank you, Tom.
Susie, can I ask you a question?
Certainly.
Yeah, this is being recorded, right?
It is.
And so once it's recorded, will it be posted somewhere?
Yes, I will get it up on YouTube, so it'll be on the NCRN channel, and I would certainly send you the link also. And
so one of the
within the next couple days. Go ahead.
Yes. So one of the takeaways from this call that every person on this call could do is, once that is up, is share it with others. Share the article, with a couple of your friends. Talk about it. The only way this is going to happen is if we sort of each one teach one. So feel free to share this. The article itself, and when the video comes out, and any of the other articles that are on here from the NCRN, share it within your networks. And I also shamelessly self-promoted the link to move to amend. If you haven't signed our motion, feel free to do it. And this thing called The Depth for Change, Selected Writings and Remarks on Social Change, is a book I just wrote. So if you're interested in checking that out, feel free to, little shameless self-promotion. I don't have an agent, so my agent, I'm the agent. So anyway.
Good. And yes, to dispel the make-believe and to get to the truth. So yes, Thank you all.
Thank you.
And yes, have a good evening.
Thank you, Greg.
Yes.
Peace.
Bye-bye.